You're sitting with a 5-year-old, pointing at words in a picture book. Cat, dog, run, jump. You say each one slowly, clearly, waiting for them to repeat it back. But their eyes drift to the illustration. They want to talk about why the cat looks angry, or whether dogs can really jump that high, or what happens next in the story. You gently redirect them to the word. Focus. Sound it out. C-A-T. Cat. They do it, mechanically, and you feel a small rush of accomplishment. Then tomorrow, they don't remember it, and you start to wonder if you're doing something wrong, or worse, if they're not ready. Here's what almost no one tells you. That entire interaction might be backwards. We've constructed this idea that teaching a child to read is about breaking language into pieces small enough for their brain to handle. Letters make sounds, sounds make words, words make meaning. It's logical, it's structured, it's how we were taught to think about reading instruction. But children didn't evolve to learn that way. And more importantly, you probably didn't actually learn to read that way either. Think about how a child learns to speak. No one sits them down with flashcards of the word hungry before they're allowed to say it. They hear it in context, embedded in care, repeated in moments of need, connected to feeling. The word arrives whole, meaningful, necessary, and one day it's theirs. They didn't decode it, they absorbed it. Reading, we're told, is different. Reading requires instruction, systematic phonics, controlled vocabulary. And yes, there's truth there. Reading is not as instinctive as speech, but we've let that truth harden into something rigid, something that forgets how human brains actually build understanding. The stereotype is this. Good parents drill their children on letter sounds. They use workbooks and apps and reading programs with structured lessons. They correct mistakes immediately. They measure progress in levels. And if the child resists or seems distracted, the parent just needs to be more consistent, more patient, more dedicated. The reality is quieter and far simpler. The children who become confident, joyful readers are almost always the ones who were read to, abundantly and without agenda, long before anyone asked them to perform reading themselves. There's a study that's been replicated across decades and demographics, and it keeps finding the same thing. The single strongest predictor of reading success isn't phonics instruction or early alphabet knowledge. It's the number of hours a child spent being read to before they started school. Not educational videos, not apps, not even audiobooks, though those help. Actual human beings reading actual stories aloud in the child's presence. Why does this matter more than formal instruction? Because reading, at its core, is not a mechanical skill, it's a meaning-making process. And children are astoundingly, almost compulsively, driven to make meaning. When you read to a child, you're modeling something profound, that these strange symbols on a page unlock entire worlds, emotions, adventures, answers to questions they didn't know they had. You're teaching them that reading is worth the effort before you ever ask them to make the effort. But we've become so anxious about reading that we've inverted the sequence. We try to teach the mechanics before we've built the desire. It's like teaching someone to use a key before they know there's a room they want to enter. Now, this doesn't mean phonics doesn't matter. It does. Learning that letters represent sounds is essential. But here's the part we misunderstand. Children learn those connections more easily, more naturally, when they already care about reading. When they've spent years watching you run your finger under words as you read their favorite story for the 100th time, they start to notice patterns themselves. They ask why that word looks like that one. They want to predict what the text will say before you say it. The mechanical learning happens faster because it's anchored to something they're genuinely motivated to understand. The psychologist Lev Vygotsky described learning as something that happens in what he called the zone of proximal development, essentially the sweet spot between what a child can do alone and what they can't do even with help. Reading to a child lives in that zone perfectly. They can't read yet, but they can follow the story. They can start to connect the sound of words with their shapes. They can begin to predict, to wonder, to engage, and all of it happens without force, without failure, without the anxiety that comes from being asked to do something they're not ready for. Take a moment here. If you've been pushing phonics flashcards or feeling guilty that your child isn't reading as early as their cousin, ask yourself, what am I actually worried about? Is it their learning, or is it my fear of falling behind an invisible standard? Because children feel that fear. They absorb it. And when reading becomes wrapped up in parental anxiety, it stops being a door to wonder and starts being a test they might fail. This is where we separate healthy support from avoidance disguised as patience. Some parents avoid teaching reading altogether because they're afraid to do it wrong, or they believe it's the school's job, or they just don't want the conflict. That's different from what we're talking about. Reading to your child isn't passive, it's deeply active. You're building vocabulary, narrative structure, attention span, emotional literacy. You're making reading irresistible. That's not avoidance, that's foundation. Historically, this isn't new wisdom. Before formal schooling became universal, children learned to read in homes where reading happened naturally. In 19th century literate households, children absorbed reading by proximity. They saw parents reading newspapers, siblings reading letters, sacred texts being read aloud at meals. The printing press didn't just make books available, it made reading visible as a worthwhile human activity. The mechanics followed from that cultural immersion. What we've done in modern education is extract reading instruction out of that context and turn it into an isolated skill, something to be taught in controlled increments at prescribed ages. And for some children, that works fine, but for many, it drains reading of its original purpose. It makes it feel like homework before they've ever experienced it as magic. So what's the easiest way to teach a child to read? Read to them, every day. Not because you're trying to teach them anything, not because you're pointing at words or quizzing them on letters, just because you're sharing a story. Let them see you lost in a book sometimes. Let them interrupt you with questions. Let them ask for the same book 17 times in a row, because repetition is how young brains solidify learning. And when they start to show interest in the words themselves, when they ask what that word says or how to spell their friend's name, you answer, you show them. You let their curiosity lead. The phonics, the sight words, the sounding out, all of that comes easier when it's in service of something they want to have. And if you're doing that, if you're reading together and letting them see reading as part of life, then you're not teaching them to read. You're teaching them that reading is worth learning, which is the only lesson that actually matters. Children don't need earlier instruction. They need richer context. They don't need more drills. They need more story. The brain builds reading skills the same way it builds language, through immersion, repetition, and emotional connection, not through isolation and performance pressure. Here's the truth underneath all of this. Teaching a child to read isn't about finding the right program or the perfect method. It's about creating an environment where reading feels as natural as conversation, where books are part of the texture of daily life, where the act of reading is modeled as something valuable, pleasurable, and worth the effort of learning. You don't need a curriculum. You need a library card and 20 minutes before bed. That's it. That's the secret. Everything else is just what we've added because we're afraid simple isn't enough. In the next video, we'll talk about what happens when a child still struggles to read despite all of this, and why that resistance might be telling you something important about how their particular brain works. And after that, we'll explore why some children teach themselves to read at 3, while others don't click until 7, and both timelines are more normal than anyone admits. But for now, just this. If you want to teach a child to read, start by showing them why anyone would want to.